Welcome to part 8 of hormones. I wanted to tell you about this Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, and it was in 1977. The Nobel Prizes are going to come out now. The announcements for this year, 2020, will be October 5th. So we'll be hearing about who wins the prize for physiology and medicine. And that'll be exciting, and I'll talk to you about that when it comes out. But for now, let's go back to 1977. Here's a Frenchman who won the Nobel Prize for isolating 1 milligram of thyrotropin-releasing hormone, TRH. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone is a hormone that comes from the hypothalamus and stimulates the pituitary. So this is to give you an idea of what tiny, tiny quantities are used. So he had to use 50 tons of sheep hypothalami. He got from the slaughterhouse the sheep brains and dissected them. But he had 50 tons of this and 1 million pig hypothalami in order to isolate the quantity of hormone that he needed. So that goes to show how it's in tiny quantities that these hormones work in our bodies. And if you really want to study it, you have to collect it from hundreds, thousands of sheep, 1 million pigs. So again, to tell you that a small amount of secretory neurons in a hypothalamus can control the anterior pituitary. This is the boss again, the boss that is releasing these hormones, trophic hormones, remember, that are going to stimulate the pituitary. And when you think of what the anterior pituitary controls, when we talked about GH, prolactin, TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, all of those, what they're doing is they're controlling metabolism, which is every single reaction you have in your body, chemical reaction. It's controlling growth, and it's controlling reproduction. And so if that's not a big job, what is? It's a huge job, all coming from this tiny little area in the brain. One example of this sequence here, again, that we were talking about in the last video, is the thyroid hormone control. And again, we're going to have these boxes that are, what's the stimulus here, what's the integrating center, the pathway, the effector, and the response. Let's look at here the hypothalamus. Okay, these are all integrating centers, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid gland. Remember, step 1, step 2, and step 3. So the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone that's going to affect the pituitary. What hormone is that? TRH. I'm going to backtrack. Thyrotropin releasing hormone was the one that this Frenchman isolated. So this thyrotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus, and it will affect the pituitary. The pituitary, once it gets that signal, releases another hormone, TSH, we talked about, and that is thyroid stimulating hormone. Not releasing, but stimulating. What does that do? The stimulating hormone then is going to affect the thyroid gland. This is a drawing of it here, and it would be in the neck by your Adam's apple. It stimulates the thyroid gland then, which in turn is going to release this T3, T4, and we call that before, let's see if I can do it without this clicking on me, thyroxine. Thyroxine. T3, T4 is thyroxine. So that T3 and T4 is what is going to affect your metabolic rate, right? So here it's written systemic metabolic effects. So in order to regulate your metabolism, it's coming from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the thyroid gland to finally release the hormone that's affecting that metabolic rate. Okay, that sequence is important, and that sequence repeats itself with other hormones. The pathology that I mentioned before was hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. hyperthyroidism. And this poor lady who appears in every single biology book with a big goiter there, it's because which of the two is the question? Is it hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism that's causing this condition? The interesting thing is that both these conditions can cause the symptoms. Interesting why that happens. So if it's hyperthyroidism, the thyroid has become overactive and it grows because it's producing too much of the thyroxine, and it's hyperactive for some reason, and it's super productive, and it's swollen up, and it's giving this pathology, this condition of goiter. It's called goiter. What about the hypothyroidism? Well, in hypothyroidism, the thyroid isn't producing enough thyroxine, so the pituitary sends over more thyroid-stimulating hormone, and the thyroid doesn't respond. And so then the pituitary sends over more thyroid-stimulating hormone, and the thyroid doesn't respond because it's got hypothyroidism. So then the pituitary sends over even more of this TSH, and this overstimulation by TSH onto the thyroid also produces goiter. So either of those conditions can actually result in this swollen area of the neck by the thyroid gland. Very interesting. Another gland that we need to look at are your parathyroid glands. So in this diagram here, you're looking at the posterior aspect. So you're looking behind the thyroid. This big area here is thyroid gland. Thyroid. So if you look in anterior, you'd see the whole thing, but this is posterior. There's a little spot here, a spot here, 2, 3, and 4. Those are your parathyroid glands that sit on top of the thyroid in posterior view. So that hormone increases plasma calcium concentrations. So in the event that your concentration of calcium in the blood were too low, then the parathyroid gland is going to increase that. It's going to put more calcium into the plasma for it to circulate around, to be used by the body however it needs to be. So there is a G protein, as a sensor that works as a sensor, and it's a calcium sensing receptor. And when those levels are low on the parathyroid gland, it sort of triggers then the release of parathyroid hormone. And that parathyroid hormone is responsible for elevating calcium levels in the blood. So essentially, where does it get it? It elevates the calcium, but where does it go to get it? Well, it goes to the bone where you've stored it. So osteoclasts, remember from anatomy, are going to dissolve matrix, a type of cell that breaks down cells and releases that calcium. So that's what PTH does. It goes to the bone, it affects, that hormone affects the bone so that osteoclasts then start to dissolve the matrix and release some of that calcium into the blood. So that's one way to get more calcium circulating. How else? Well, it sends a message, the hormone, to the kidney to reabsorb more of the calcium. So don't eliminate it in the urine. Instead, reabsorb that calcium. What else? It also affects the intestine, and the intestine then increases its intestinal absorption. You don't have any going out the other end. You're going to hold on to that calcium and increase the amount that you can actually absorb and not lose any of it. So when all of these happen, you increase absorption, you stop the urinating it out, and you remove some from the bone, your calcium levels in the blood, of course, will rise. One last concept that I have touched on before, and that is some hormones are secreted by neurons. You don't always think of that. You think of it as a gland that's secreting a hormone. But sometimes it's actually a neuron, and we call it a neurohormone. So often this happens, as I've been showing you, in the hypothalamus. you have in the hypothalamus, you have a hormone is made in the hypothalamus and packaged in the cell body of a neuron, and then it travels down the axon of the neuron here, and it dumps it into the pituitary. So in this case, into the posterior pituitary, and then it will actually be released. Sorry, this mouse of mine is so sensitive. So remember, when it's anterior pituitary, you have these secretory cells here that are actually making hormone and releasing it. The posterior pituitary doesn't look that way. It's actually not making it. It's delivered. That hormone is delivered from the hypothalamus into this region and then secreted, right? For ADH and oxytocin. So where are they made? They're made in the hypothalamus. They're neurons in the hypothalamus. And this is showing the vesicle transported down into the posterior pituitary. And that was the last slide. So we'll stop this there. And that was also the last slide for hormones. Thanks for listening.